I want to welcome everybody to Pastor's Perspective, where, we are, on Fridays trying to take stock of everything that's happened during the week. I mean, I'm laughing because it's getting harder and harder to do this because things break every single day now. It used to be there was like one news item a week to react to. Now you have to do something like this, every single day to keep up with it. But I'm here with Tomalea Bench, Sugarland Bible Church member, very good political student, has a heart for getting Christians involved in the political process. So we always appreciate her stopping by and visiting with us. We're kind of continuing the discussion we started last time. Actually, the last two times. This is part 3. It's called Our Tyrannical Judiciary, Part 3. And one of the things that's happened is out of the state of Washington. And this happened about mid-February. The Washington State Supreme Court, 9-0. Can you believe that? Not even a dissenting voice anywhere. I mean, you would think at least one jurist would dissent. This is related to a woman who had a longtime gay customer. So it shows you that she's not, against homosexuals per se. She had served him for years. She's a florist. She declined his desire for her to send flowers to his same-sex wedding ceremony or use her artistic abilities in that respect. And she politely declined. She recommended 3 other florists. We're dealing with a 72-year-old grandmother, so not a jihadist type lady at all. She has actually employed gay workers and served gay customers for years, but she just reached a point where, look, I'm not going to use my artistic abilities as a florist to use my services for your same-sex wedding, which seems kind of reasonable. She has biblical convictions, and she had a limit. Well, she finds herself in the middle of a lawsuit, which ends up potentially costing her fees as high as $1 million. Mm-hmm. So obviously this lawsuit is designed to cripple her. It's like a signal they're sending her. And the case goes all the way before the Washington State Supreme Court, and the court 9-0 sides against her. That's what's going on. So she is being coerced under the force of law to violate her own conscience, is basically what's happening. This is not an isolated case. The same kind of case you can find out of the state of Colorado with a man named Jack Phillips, a baker. Identical set of facts. The same type of case you can find with the Kleins, Aaron and Melissa Klein. Identical set of facts. That they were charged with an egregious fine, and it has to do with their decision to decline to bake a cake for a lesbian commitment ceremony. And so what is actually happening in this country is there's a collision course between civil rights, and I put civil rights in quotation marks, versus violating people's longstanding convictions. And you've heard of cases like this. Can you think of any others that come to mind, or any similar situations off the top of your head? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I thought that New Mexico had one. Mm-hmm. I've forgotten now who it was. Mm-hmm. It was as soon as the state passed the law, mm-hmm. then they used it.
Then they used it against the person.
They used it as the hammer.
Mm-hmm. So this is like not an isolated situation. I mean, these are breaking out all over the country. So what we're trying to do in these pastors' perspectives on our tyrannical judiciary and how to fix it is we're trying to explain to people the collision course that we're in when you manufacture civil rights. And if people would go back to our prior show that we did, and you can find it archived on our Facebook page, on my personal Facebook page, and also the Sugarland Bible Church Facebook page. And it's also on YouTube. You just type into the search engine Andy Woods and pastor's perspective. It should pop up. We showed, and I don't want to reteach all of that because it was a lot to get through, but that being a homosexual is not the same thing as being black,
right,
or Hispanic or Asian. In other words, when those that put together the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did so, they had specific criteria. There was actually 4 pieces of criteria that they looked at. Those are the size of the group, an immutable characteristic, a pattern of discrimination based on that immutable characteristic, and is the immutable characteristic harmless, or what they called innocuous. And you can look at the plight that blacks in this country have been through, and you can very clearly see that they fit all 4 criteria very easily. But the same-sex movement doesn't fit that criteria. And so what we have happening in our country is the judicial system is just inventing rights. They're deviating, from the standard criteria. And when that happens, it puts you on a collision course with the rights that already exist. In other words, this is a zero-sum game. You increase someone else's rights, and by definition, someone else's rights have to shrink. So it's not a kind of scenario where we can just create rights and other rights are left intact. So there's this quote from Daniel Horowitz, I think it's number 13, who's one of my favorite political writers. And in Conservative Review, he articulates this much better than I could. Do you mind reading that, if you have it there?
What happens when courts create faux rights, such as the right for foreign nationals to immigrate, the right for states to demand more immigrants from the federal government, the right for illegal aliens to obtain driver's licenses, or the right to 15 days of early voting? Inevitably, the courts overlook the most foundational rights that are written in plain English, the ones that serve as the foundation of our republic.
So what happens is if you create a right, you overlook the rights that are written in plain English that we've always enjoyed. So as the courts and our legislatures, to some extent, are taking civil rights protection legitimately afforded to racial minorities and giving that to groups based on a behavior or a lifestyle, out the window or out the door goes someone else's rights. And in this case, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. In the case of the lady in Washington, I didn't give her name. I think her name is Baronelle Stutzman.
Mm-hmm.
Out the door goes her right to object based on conscience. And so that's sort of what we're trying to explain here to people. And later on, we're going to be explaining not just what the problem is, but what people can actually do to fix it. But you can't really solve a problem unless you know it exists. So it would be like this. And if someone is not a Christian, they may not be sympathetic to our perspective. But the fact of the matter is the Bible from cover to cover, we went through many verses last time, condemns not homosexuals, but homosexuality. It's not an arbitrary belief. The Christianity has held this for 2,000 years. It's been the 2,000-year-old tradition of Christianity that homosexuality is a sin. Obviously, Mrs. Stutzman believes that, and she stood on the basis of conviction, and what she's being told is she must comply with what this same-sex couple wants to do. So she has to violate her own convictions. It would be like, let's say somebody is Jewish, and they have Holocaust survivors, in their family or in their family tree, or maybe they themselves are a Holocaust survivor, and they happen to own a bakery or a flower shop, and some Nazi group comes to town, and says, we're having a Nazi rally or a Nazi event, and we want you to bake cakes or supply flowers for our Nazi event. And you could see how a Jewish-owned and operated business would politely decline that. And the court comes in and says, well, you've got to do it anyway. Well, they've just trashed the right of conscience of the Jewish couple. That's the only equivalent I can think of to explain to the non-Christian world what these jurists are doing to this 72-year-old grandmother. And this is just totally outrageous what's happening. And what is taking place is the legal language is being shifted before our eyes. There is a movement away from free exercise of religion to simply the right to teach and advocate. And I want to show people exactly how that's happening in modern Supreme Court language. So let's go back to the beginning. I have quote number 15, which is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. I think most people are aware of it, but since some of these things aren't even taught in schools anymore, we might have to read it.
We might have to read it.
So why don't you go ahead and read the First Amendment?
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Okay, you see the language there? Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It doesn't say here a right to teach and advocate. It's talking about free exercise of religion. And free exercise is not just what you teach or advocate in a church, it's the way you live your life. So, for example, I would think that Mrs. Stutzman has the right to decline service to whom she wants, as long as she's not racially discriminating. That's illegal. She's not doing that. Decline service to whom she wants on the basis of freedom of religion. And free exercise is a very broad category, which would encompass her right. For example, let's say you have a Christian college, and the Christian college has a rule about dormitories. Men should be in one dormitory, women should be in another. And some legal system or judge comes in and says, well, you can't discriminate on that basis. Well, wouldn't the college's free exercise of religion trump some judge's perspective on this? So free exercise is a very broad category. It doesn't just relate to what you say, what you teach, what you advocate. It should protect what you do in your dealings, your business dealings, and things you do outside of church. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's what the First Amendment guarantees. Now watch the sleight of hand here. This comes from the Obergefell decision, written by Justice Kennedy, and I think it's quote 16.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and notice what he does here. This is the same-sex constitutional right decision that came down June of 2015. And what he did is he rewrote the First Amendment. So look at the language here. And keep in mind the language that was just read earlier, free exercise of religion.
Finally, it must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that, by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should not be condoned. The First Amendment ensures that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths, and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure they have long revered. The same is true of those who oppose same-sex marriage for other reasons.
Now, see what he just did there? He's creating this constitutional right to same-sex marriage. That's what the Obergefell decision really was about. Then the question becomes, well, what about people, what about states, what about churches that may not want to comply? He uses the expression, well, you can continue to advocate and teach whatever you want. And you notice the language he chose not to use. He chose not to use the language of the First Amendment, which is freedom of exercise. And what he just did with the stroke of a pen is he took religious freedom, which used to be way out here, and he just shrunk it to the four walls of the church. You can say whatever you want in your church, but you can't decline service to a same-sex couple, is basically what he said. In other words, the free exercise concept that used to protect you no longer protects you. So in a 5-4 decision, with the stroke of a pen, that right was shrunk, is basically what he just did there. And notice how Chief Justice Roberts, who I was sort of upset with for a while. I still am upset with him because he upheld Obamacare. I know you're upset too. Mm-hmm. But he came out on the right side on this in this decision, and he wrote a very stinging dissent, and this comes from pages 27 and 28 of his dissenting opinion, and he picks up on this immediately. Notice what he says here.
Okay. The majority graciously suggests that religious believers may continue to advocate and teach their views of marriage. The First Amendment guarantees, however, the freedom to exercise religion. Ominously, that is not a word the majority uses. Hard questions arise when people of faith exercise religion in ways that may be seen to conflict with the new right to same-sex marriage. When, for example, a religious college provides married student housing only to opposite-sex married couples, or a religious adoption agency declines to place children with same-sex married couples.
You see what he said there? Oh, the majority, and that's what judges do in the dissenting opinion, they criticize the majority opinion, uses the language advocate and teach, but what got omitted was exercise of religion, free exercise of religion, which is what the actual First Amendment says. And then he says, you know, what are we going to do if a college provides, it's the scenario I made earlier, or drew earlier, a religious college provides married student housing only to opposite-sex married couples, or a religious adoption agency declines to place children with same-sex married couples. Well, guess what? Tough tacos.
Yeah.
The First Amendment no longer protects you. It only protects what you advocate and teach in your church. And so with the Obergefell decision, June 2005, the free exercise clause of the First Amendment just got shrunk. And people need to understand this. This is the left's agenda for the United States. You can hold your religious view, but just keep your mouth shut about it and do it in the appropriate place. And we're going to define what the appropriate place is. It's this little tiny box over here. Don't bring it into your business life. Don't bring it into your business dealings. Don't bring it into your decision with, you know, how you're going to use your creative skills as a florist or a baker that God has given you. You keep your mouth shut. You keep it out of your public life, and you can talk about it in your church. That is the left's agenda for the United States. And I have a tendency to think that this little box that they've given us is going to keep on shrinking.
It'd be like one of those spy movies. The walls are coming in.
Yeah. Now, notice, and by the way, I don't know if I wanted to harp on this or not, but I guess I will. I'm in a feisty mood today. This decision was authored by Justice Kennedy, who was appointed by, do you know the answer to that?
You got me last time. I think I said Reagan, and you corrected me. Wasn't it...
You said Bush, and I said no, it was Reagan.
Oh, okay. So now I know it's Reagan.
It's Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan, one of our political heroes, appointed this guy to the bench, and he's the one that wrote the Obergefell decision. Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade, was appointed by Richard Nixon, Republican.
Yeah.
David Souter, who wrote a terrible decision called the Kelo decision, which shrunk our right to property, was appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush. And then Justice Roberts, who wrote a great dissent in Obergefell, but also upheld Obamacare, was appointed by Bush, 43. The second Bush, 43. So a lot of people think that if there's an R in front of the name, that means it's all going to be great, right? Now, I will concede that with a Republican president, you got a better chance of getting a conservative judge than a Democratic president. But it's not necessarily true that Republican presidents always appoint conservative judges. A lot of times you don't even know what a judge is going to become until he's already on the bench. So, I don't know, are you bothered by the fact that we put a lot of emphasis on if there's an R in front of the name, it must be good. If there's a D in front of the name, it must be bad? Does that strike a chord with you at all?
Oh, it strikes a chord with me. And, you know, as I recall, our last conversation, we spoke about how that's used as a campaign issue. And was it the week after that in my mailbox, I got my little solicitation, and I was going to bring that with me as evidence, you know, to back up what you had said, because there it was. They put my name in it. They said, Tomalea.
Yeah.
You must vote for us. So, yeah.
It's almost like many times they don't want to fix this problem because they're going to forfeit a campaign issue. And, you know, the Democrats might do it also. They have no desire, I don't think, to fix really what's wrong with the inner cities. Because if they fixed it, they would lose a key constituency. And I kind of feel like we as conservative Christians are always being corralled to vote a certain way every 4 years, particularly with the presidency, rallying around this issue of the Supreme Court when the whole thing is fixable if you just put the right people on the court. I understand that sometimes you don't know which way a judge is going to go, but you can look into a person's background pretty carefully, and like with Anthony Scalia, and figure out if they're a constitutionalist or not. You don't put people on the bench with no track record. You put people on the bench that have a demonstrated philosophy of putting the Constitution above their own personal politics. And that's a good lesson for us to follow. You know, we shouldn't just be cheerleaders for somebody or something because there's an R in front of the name. So Kennedy is the one that wrote this terrible Obergefell decision where he took the free exercise clause and shrunk it. Now, notice what Tammy Baldwin, do you know her? She's a Wisconsin senator.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know anything about her?
I don't know anything about her, but you know, just the fact that she's a state-level senator rather than a U.S. senator from Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But notice what she said right after the Obergefell decision. It was like it was handed down on Friday. This goes back to June of 2015. I had the exact date here, June 15th, 2015. I think that was handed down on a Friday. Isn't it interesting? They always toss this stuff at us on a Friday when we're not paying attention.
Just about this time.
Just about this time. And then she says something the next day. I'm pretty sure it was Friday. You guys can look that up. But notice quote number 18.
So she was asked, should the bakery have to bake the cake for the gay couple getting married? Where do you come down on that? Baldwin responded, certainly the First Amendment says that in institutions of faith that there is absolute power to observe deeply held religious beliefs. But I don't think it extends far beyond that.
See, that's an astounding quote there. You can have your deep-seated, Mrs. Stutzman, you can have your deep-seated beliefs as long as it's connected to a religious institution. But don't bring it into your business life.
Yeah.
She clearly says right here in this quote, I don't think it extends beyond that. And this is the left's agenda, as I said before, to shrink freedom of religion to the four walls of the church. I mean, what they want is a religion-free, particularly a Christian-free world or society where Christianity has no influence on the choices that we make.
Right.
And, it's Jesus, did he not say, out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. So you can tell a lot about what people say when they're just speaking serendipitously, like Tammy Baldwin was. It's a revelation of what they want. And at some point, we as Christians are going to have to wake up to this, or we're going to find ourselves living in literal incarceration at some point, because they're just going to keep shrinking until really there's no place to go. But maybe a jail cell or a indoctrination facility,
re-education camp.
There you go. That's a better re-education camp where our minds have to be shifted. Which, by the way, Hillary Clinton said. You remember that? Mm-hmm. She basically made the statement that people that hold deeply held religious beliefs are going to have them altered. Mm-hmm. Now, in that statement, she didn't tell us how she was going to alter them. But indoctrination facilities are a key leftist tool that they use to change the values of people like you, and myself. And so it's interesting that they come out and they say this in unguarded moments. Notice this quote here from Randy Sly, who is a conservative blogger, and he pointed this out all the way back in 2010. This is quote number 19.
Let's be clear, however, language matters when it comes to defining freedoms and limits. A shift from freedom of religion to freedom of worship moves the dialogue from the world stage into the physical confines of a church, temple, synagogue, or mosque. Such limitations can unleash an unbridled initiative that we have only experienced in a mild way through actions determined to remove roadside crosses, wearing of religious t-shirts and pro-life pins, as well as any initiatives of evangelization. It also could exclude our right to raise our children in our faith, the right to religious education, literature or media, the right to raise funds or organize charitable activities, and the right to express religious beliefs in the normal discourse of life.
So now this is 2010. Then President Obama started to not use the expression free exercise of religion. He started to substitute for that freedom of worship, which is exactly what's happened with Obergefell. It's exactly what's going on with this poor lady, in the state of Washington and the other cases in Oregon and in Colorado. It's a redefinition of terms. And this blogger, Randy Sly, points out it's a shift from freedom of religion to freedom of worship, which moves the dialogue from the world stage. World stage is out there where I'm making my decisions in life, to the confines of a church, a temple, or a synagogue. Now, freedom of free exercise of religion used to govern how we raise our children, what kind of school I put my daughter in, passing out literature, in a public place, the right to go out and raise funds or organize for charitable activities, the right to express religious beliefs in the normal discourse of life. Free exercise of religion governed all that, but with this sleight of hand and now you see it, now you don't, what you have is a change of vocabulary to freedom of worship, which says you have no rights out there. The only thing you have a right to do, according to the Obergefell decision, is teach and advocate in your church. We're going to shrink your sphere of influence and keep your mouth shut in the process. So, these are not scare tactics I'm using. We're quoting actual politicians. We're quoting actual Supreme Court opinions. And we're explaining why this case in Washington is coming down the way it's coming down. In other words, we've created a new civil right out of thin air, and as Daniel Horowitz says, this is a zero-sum game. What's happening is the existing rights that we think we once had, that we did once have, are now getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I don't know, do you see this trend changing without aggressive action? It just seems like it's like a giant freight truck spinning out of control. It doesn't seem like it can be stopped.
No, I don't see it changing without action. I think we do have to stand up and just say, no, that's not correct.
Right. And anytime a politician uses the expression freedom of worship, I think we should immediately correct that person either by social media, email, writing letters to the newspaper, calling talk shows. I was listening to a talk show one time and someone named Tomalea Bench called in. And I think that's a great way to get our voice out there. So it is not freedom of worship, folks. It is free exercise of religion. And let's not let them, alter the vocabulary on us. Now, continuing on here, you'll notice that Justice Alito in Obergefell wrote a tremendous dissent. I have an excerpt from that. And what people have to understand in the Obergefell case is it was a 5-person majority, and rarely do you have each dissenting justice write their own dissent. But this agitated everybody so much that you've got 4 dissents here. One we've already read from Roberts, part of it. You've got another one from Alito, another one from Justice Thomas, And then a fourth one, the best one, which I don't even have, is Scalia's dissent. But notice I'm just excerpting things from their dissents where they are commenting on the shrinkage of rights. So do you have the page 6 and 7 of Justice Alito's dissent, quote 20?
Today's decision usurps the constitutional right of the people to decide whether to keep or alter the traditional understanding of marriage. The decision will also have other important consequences. It will be used to vilify Americans who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy. In the course of its opinion, the majority compares traditional marriage laws to laws that denied equal treatment for African Americans and women. The implications of this analogy will be exploited by those who are determined to stamp out every vestige of dissent. Perhaps recognizing how its reasoning may be used, the majority attempts towards the end of its opinion to reassure those who oppose same-sex marriage that their rights of conscience will be protected. We will soon see whether this proves to be true. I assume that those who cling to old beliefs will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes, but if they repeat those views in public, they will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools.
See, notice what he says here. That last sentence you read, Justice Alito in dissent. I assume that those who cling to the old beliefs, I guess that's the 2,000-year-old position of the church, that homosexuality is a sin, will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes. But if they repeat those views in public, they will be risked being labeled as bigots and treated by governments, employers, and schools. In other words, he recognizes what the majority decision just did, how it shrunk free exercise back to the four walls of the church. You can hold your personal beliefs, but don't let it enter into your business decisions, is basically what the majority said, and that's what's happening with this 72-year-old grandmother in the state of Washington. In my whole adult life, I have never seen a greater con game than what is happening right now related to civil rights. I have never seen so much propaganda and deceit where people actually believe that being a homosexual is the same thing as Rosa Parks, being denied a seat on the bus back in the 1950s. I mean, I've never thought the American people would fall for this level of deception. That's why in the prior episode, we went through carefully why the same-sex movement doesn't fit the definition of legal civil rights. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Well, just looking at Justice Alito's comment here, I'm struck by the fact that he says that those who are determined to stamp out every vestige of dissent. He, I think, fully understands that the agenda that's driving this, they're not going to sit back. They're going to now use this ruling as ammunition, and so he uses to stamp out every vestige. That to me is very strong language, warning to us.
And stamp out every vestige. I've watched this for years, what the same-sex movement has done. They are out to change every institution, organization that would have any kind of biblical conviction against homosexuality. I remember they went in the Clinton years, they went into the military to change that. They declared war in the 1990s on the Boy Scouts so severely that the Boy Scouts finally threw in the towel on the whole thing. Now they're going after this lady in Washington. And I'm a pastor of a church, I mean, how long is it going to be until they beat down the doors of my church and my pulpit and my biblical teaching? Are they going to stop with this lady in Washington? They're not going to stop. This just keeps getting bolder and bolder and bolder. And they don't want anybody in this culture with any conviction that homosexuality is a sin. And if you happen to hold that conviction, A, you need to be re-educated, as Hillary said. Or B, we're going to shrink your influence so severely that it won't impact anything. And this is the collision course that we're in. And, Christians need to wake up and smell the coffee. This is a trend that's been going on for multiple decades in our society, and we're going to give some action steps in a minute, but unless this trend is aggressively resisted, it will not go away. It's a freight train spiraling out of control. Do you have the quote from Justice Thomas, who
Yes.
wrote a tremendous dissenting opinion in Obergefell? And why don't you read that if you could? That's quote number 21, I think it is.
Yes, sir. In our society, marriage is not simply a governmental institution. It is a religious institution as well. Today's decision might change the former, but it cannot change the latter. It appears all but inevitable that the two will come into conflict, particularly as individuals and churches are confronted with demands to participate in and endorse civil marriages between same-sex couples. The majority appears unmoved by that inevitability. It makes only a weak gesture toward religious liberty in a single paragraph. And even that gesture indicates a misunderstanding of religious liberty in our nation's tradition. Religious liberty is about more than just the protection for religious organizations and persons, as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths. Religious liberty is about freedom of action in matters of religion generally, and the scope of that liberty is directly correlated to the civil restraints placed upon religious practice. Although our Constitution provides some protection against such governmental restrictions on religious practices, the people have long elected to afford broader protections than this court's constitutional precedents mandate.
See, and this is just brilliant in this dissent. You know, this underlying language. It appears all but inevitable that the two, now what two is he talking about? The manufactured civil rights and deep-seated religious convictions. It appears inevitable that the two will come into conflict, particularly as individuals and churches are confronted with the demands to participate and endorse civil marriages between same-sex couples. Now, those words are almost prophetic, because what happened was the situation in Washington just a couple of years, year and a half, 2 years later. He says the majority appears unmoved by the inevitability. It makes a weak gesture towards religious liberty in a single paragraph. So the only time the Obergefell majority acknowledged this conflict is in one paragraph. And so what did they say? They didn't even quote the First Amendment correctly.
Right.
They used the expression teach and advocate. They didn't talk about free exercise. And did you catch this part I had underlined here? Religious liberty is about freedom of what? Action. The free exercise of religion just doesn't govern what I think, what I say, and what I advocate. It governs my life.
What I do.
What I do. And that's what is disappearing. In this decision, it's what's disappearing with Mrs. Stutzman. And that inevitably happens when you create a civil right out of thin air. And the civil right you create doesn't adhere to the traditional criteria of civil rights. That's why we're bringing this to people's attention. Well, you're gonna get mad at me for having to do this, but here's quote 22, which is a lengthy excerpt from an article written by David Barton, the president and founder of Wall Builders. And normally I like to just quote parts of articles, but he says everything so well it was hard to leave anything out. So how's your reading skills there?
I got my whistle wet, but I may have to take an occasional sip.
Yeah. Now, if you get tired, just cue me and I'll read part of it too.
Okay.
But can you read
Cue?
quote? Yeah, right.
Okay.
Quote 22.
Court decisions like that against Baronel Stutzman are making America more and more like the tyrannical governments of Europe that millions of early colonists fled in order to be free from the government persecution of their inalienable rights of religious conscience. Here's a simple question. What is America's first protected, most important, and longest cherished politically protected right? The answer? The rights of religious conscience. But the Supreme Court of Washington State just became another in the line of recent courts who know nothing of or don't care about this inalienable right. The early colonists arriving in America came largely seeking this right. In Europe, the governments consistently told them how to practice their faith, and punished them if they did not do what the government wanted. But the religious-minded colonists believed that no one but God could tell them how to practice their faith. The Pilgrims journeyed to America in 1620 to escape the hounding government persecution in England, as did 20,000 Puritans in the 1630s. In 1632, government-persecuted Catholics fled to America. In 1654, persecuted Jews from Portugal. In 1680, persecuted Quakers arrived here, as did persecuted Anabaptists from Germany in 1683. 400,000 persecuted Protestants from France in 1685, and so forth. These settlers, having been punished for exercising their rights of religious conscience, promptly enshrined these rights in their own governing documents, including Rhode Island in 1640, Maryland in 1649, Jersey in 1664, Carolina in 1665, Pennsylvania in 1682, and so forth. As John Quincy Adams affirmed, the transcendent and overruling principle of the first settlers of New England was conscience. In 1776, when America separated from Great Britain, the rights of religious conscience were once again promptly preserved in the new state constitutions and then in the federal constitution. According to the Founding Fathers, this was one of the most important rights they protected. No provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience. Our rulers can have no authority over such natural rights as only we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted. It is inconsistent with the spirit of our laws and Constitution to force tender consciences. That was Thomas Jefferson. Government is instituted to protect property of every sort. Conscience is the most sacred of all property. That was James Madison, signer of the Constitution. The rights of conscience and private judgment are by nature subject to no control but that of deity, and in that free situation they are now left. That was John Jay, an author of the Federalist Papers and the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Consciences of men are not the objects of human legislation. The state does not have any concern in the matter. For in what manner doth it affect society? In what form we think it best to pay our adoration to God? That was William Livingston, a signer of the U.S. Constitution. Based on this long tradition today, conscientious objectors are not forced to fight in wars. Jehovah's Witnesses are not required to say the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools. The Amish are not required to complete the standard 12 years of education. Christian Scientists are not forced to have their children vaccinated or undergo medical procedures often required by state laws. Seventh-day Adventists cannot be penalized for refusing to work on Saturday. And there are many additional examples. It was because the rights of religious conscience were so important that they were specifically protected in the constitutions of the individual states, such as that of Washington, which declares, and this is from their constitution, absolute...
Let me just interrupt you. In the very state where they're violating Mrs. Stutzman's rights, their own constitution in the state of Washington says...
Absolute freedom of conscience in all matters of religious sentiment, belief, and worship shall be guaranteed to every individual, and no one shall be molested or disturbed in person or property on account of religion. That's the end of that quote. But despite the clarity of this clause, we now get word that the Washington Supreme Court has ruled that Baronelle Stutzman, a devout and pious Christian florist, was bound by state law to use her artistic talents to design floral arrangements to celebrate what she viewed as an immoral event, a gay wedding. The pretext for overriding the florist's rights to free speech and religious liberty was Washington's so-called public accommodations law, which required the owner, Baronelle Stutzman, to provide goods and services to customers regardless of their sexual orientation. Several things are wrong with this decision. First, Baronelle has been economically fined and governmentally coerced to use her talents and skills in a way that violates her sincerely held religious beliefs. Second, the explicit wording of the Washington State Constitution has been completely ignored by the Washington State Supreme Court. In essence, a Washington State court has deemed the Washington State Constitution to be unconstitutional, just because they don't want to uphold its provisions. Third, the court elevated a state law, their public accommodations law, above the state constitution. But Constitution always trumps statutory laws. Always. Fourth, John Adams described us as a government of laws and not of men. But decisions like this make us just the opposite. The personal predilections of judges are now routinely placed above constitutional provisions duly enacted by the people. 2 centuries ago, Thomas Jefferson rejoiced that the comparisons of our government with those of Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell, but this happy distinction is now disappearing. Because of this ruling, and dozens more like it in recent years, America is becoming more and more like the tyrannical governments of Europe that millions of early colonists fled in order to be free from the government persecution of their inalienable rights of religious conscience.
End of article. Thank you for laboring through that. Now you can pause and get a drink of water. If people wanted to get this article, the title of it is The United States of ... not America, published by David Barton, President and founder of Wall Builders, February 21st, 2017. The reason I like this article is because sometimes a millimeter of history can trump a mile of logic. In other words, you can argue logically until the cows come home to win your point, but sometimes if you just look at history, your point can be made much easier. The point is, this decision by the state of Washington, their Supreme Court, is un-American, because America has always stood on the principle of freedom of conscience. That's why, as David Barton well articulates, the Pilgrims began a long list of people that came to this America because they were being coerced against their conscience to worship a certain way in Europe. That's why this country started, to rescue people who wanted to do things according to their own conscience. And I like what he says here. In 1776, when America separated from Great Britain, the rights of religious conscience were once again promptly preserved in the new state constitutions and then put into the federal constitution. And he gives all the evidence here. Based on this tradition today, he talks about people that don't have to do things
Right.
if it violates their conscience. Jehovah's Witnesses are not required to say the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools. He talks about the Amish, the Christian Scientists, the Seventh-day Adventists. In other words, as long as you can demonstrate that your conscience is rooted in something reasonable or in other words, it can't be arbitrary. It can't be capricious. It can't be, well, I just don't like homosexuals, so I'll discriminate against them. As long as you can demonstrate that your conviction is rooted in something long-standing and reasonable, free exercise of religion used to protect that. And I think Mrs. Stutzman has a great case in terms of conscience. She's standing on a tradition that's not arbitrary. It's what the church for 2,000 years has taught on this issue of homosexuality. You know, we went through a lot of the verses last time. Old Testament, New Testament. You know, God loves homosexuals, but he condemns homosexuality just like he loves adulterers, but condemns adultery, just like he loves thieves, but condemns theft. I mean, come on, this is not some kind of civil right that puts you on equal par as Rosa Parks. That's an apples and oranges comparison that people are making here. And I love how David Barton's article actually quotes the Washington State Constitution, which, by the way, the Washington State Supreme Court never bothered to quote this. You know, this goes back to the state of Washington and when it was founded. Absolute freedom of conscience in all matters of religious sentiments, belief, and worship shall be guaranteed to every individual. Look at this. No one shall be molested or disturbed in person, property, or account of religion. Wouldn't that include Mrs. Stutzman in her decision as a florist?
Well, I think she meets that criteria right there. They've done both.
Yeah. And see, what's happening is they're creating this new civil right, and as we've explained, what happens is the traditional rights disappear. No one cares about this on the Washington State Supreme Court. All they care about is protecting their new civil right that they've created out of thin air. I love how David Barton lists 4 things wrong with this decision. I love this quote here. Thomas Jefferson rejoiced that the comparisons of our government with those of Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell. I love that because there's so much talk today in the world of politics that we need to be like Europe. There's so much, now I'm a theologian, there's so much respect that theologians give to European scholars. You know, they're supposedly a cut above everybody else. And I love what Thomas Jefferson says here. Comparing America to Europe is like comparing the difference between heaven and hell. That's just fantastic. And what he's basically, David Barton is saying is we're going against history, we're going against tradition, we're creating civil rights out of thin air, and the long-standing right that America was founded on, right of conscience, is disappearing. And the Washington State case with Mrs. Stutzman is just more evidence of that. Now, this one's your fault. This is quote 23, because you sent this to me. When the state of Texas was debating passing pastoral protection legislation, which I think we're going to get to in a little bit if we have time. But Article 1, Section 6 of the Texas Constitution, as originally adopted in 1876, has the same sort of clause in it which protects people from having to be governmentally coerced to violate their conscience. Do you want to, since you sent this to me, I'll have you read this.
Okay.
It's shorter than the other thing we read.
Okay. All men have a natural and indefeasible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences. No man shall be compelled to attend, erect, or support any place of worship, or to maintain any ministry against his consent. No human authority ought, in any case whatever, to control or interfere with the rights of conscience in matters of religion, and no preference shall ever be given by law to any religious society or mode of worship, but it shall be the duty of the legislature to pass such laws as necessary to protect equally every religious denomination in the peaceable enjoyment of its own mode of public worship.
There it is in plain English. No human authority ought, in any case whatever, to control or interfere with the rights of conscience in matters of religion. So if you're a florist, if you're a baker, and you decide not to lend your services to a same-sex wedding on the grounds that your conscience would be violated, the Texas Constitution would support you in that decision.
Mm-hmm.
If homosexuals show up at this church and they say, we want you to marry us, and I say no, the Texas Constitution should support me in that decision, because I cannot be governmentally coerced against my conscience. You know, this is America. This is what America was established upon, and that's what we're just throwing it all away. I don't think people realize how close we are to throwing everything away by not becoming visible and objecting to these sorts of tyrannical acts. I mean, do people realize how close we are to moving into a country where my conscience as a Christian is routinely violated? Do people get that? This is what frustrates me. This is what tests my progressive sanctification, the breaking point, as I like to say.
Okay. Okay, well, I could comment, but I didn't know how much further you wanted to get done, because I could get on a soapbox. What I think is going on right now for people is they're not thinking through the arguments that are presented to them. Mm-hmm. And so the arguments that are being presented to them by the other side is that, as you say, that this is a civil right, or that it's only fair, and so they think about the kindness of extending this to people, and they don't realize that, as we're saying here today, this is stepping on the rights of someone who disagrees and dissents.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. Well, the first thing they're doing is they're making us feel like we're racist.
Yes.
Because they've been able to convince us that being homosexual is the same thing as being black. So no one wants to be called a racist. And if you're made to feel like you're putting on your KKK white sheet, you know, by standing on this issue, you're going to be intimidated into silence. The second thing, and I think this is where you're headed, is misplaced compassion. Let me give you an example. A well-known pastor, I'll just go ahead and name his name because he's written a big article about it, Andy Stanley, the son of, legendary Charles Stanley. I like Andy Stanley because he's got my first name, and we went to the same seminary. I mean, my instincts are to want to like him, and I think he's done some good. But he comes out with a blog article saying, well, Jesus would have just gone ahead and made the cake for the same-sex wedding. Jesus would have just gone ahead and delivered flowers, because after all, didn't Jesus fellowship with the sinners? And there was another couple that comes to our church. They were attending a Bible study through another church, and this whole issue of this florist came up, and they were basically told by the Bible study leader that this florist is wrong because we know Jesus fellowship with sinners. So these are the kind of arguments that we're getting within our evangelical circles. Someone even put something like this on my Facebook page. And here's my response. I said, you're missing the point. You do not understand the point of what is happening here. If you want to, as your Christian duty, make cakes for a same-sex wedding, deliver flowers to a same-sex wedding, make flowers for a same-sex wedding, then go ahead and do that. If you feel that's your calling as a Christian, go ahead and do that. But that's not the issue. The issue is, should the state, that's what everybody's missing, should the state, should the government, through the force of law, coerce you to do it when you don't want to do it? And you're standing on your biblical beliefs that you should not do it. Should the state get into the business of forcing people against their conscience? That's the issue. And I think we need to be prepared to deflect some of these misplaced compassion type arguments that people use, like what Andy Stanley was saying, and get to the heart of the matter. Because look, folks, if the state can do it to me, if the state can do it to Mrs. Stutzman, then they can do it to you, related to your convictions. They can do it to a Jew that doesn't want to subsidize or contribute to a Nazi event. And you open that door, and the America that we once had and was founded on a particular belief dissolves. So I don't know, that's sort of my reaction to this misplaced compassion argument. So the Texas Constitution, the Washington Constitution has a freedom of conscience clause, and that's not what's being respected. Now, do you know what jurists used to do? We used to be able to trust judges because they understood these things. They understood the Constitution. They understood the history and traditions of the Republic. Mm-hmm. And when things got out of control, like they are, when someone's rights were being trampled, you used to be able to appeal this to a judge, and he would resolve it correctly for you. Not based on his personal politics. His personal politics are irrelevant. Based on what the Constitution says. So look at this quote here, and this will probably be the last quote we'll have a chance to read. It's from it's quote number 24. It's from a 1913 Texas Supreme Court case. In other words, this is what it was like when we had adults in the room. If you want to know what the country was like when adults used to run things, you go back to this case. And the issue of same-sex marriage came before this Texas Supreme Court in 1913. And look at what they said. It's astounding. You want to read that?
Marriage was not originated by human law. When God created Eve, she was a wife to Adam. They then and there occupied the status of husband to wife and wife to husband. It would be sacrilegious to apply the designation a civil contract to such a marriage. It is that and more, a status ordained by God.
Well, hold me up. I'm about ready to pass out. Apparently in 1913, some people wanted a contract, a same-sex civil contract, and this gets all the way before the Texas Supreme Court. So what does the Texas Supreme Court do? They do a Bible study. I mean, they open their Bibles and they try to figure out, well, when God created marriage, who was it between? Well, my gosh, we don't have to get very far in the Bible to see it was between Adam and Eve, not as Jerry Falwell used to say, Adam and Steve or Adam and Bruce or whatever. And they said, I'm sorry, we're not going to call this contract that you want a marriage. That's the way judges used to act in this country. In other words, judges were held in such high esteem because based on their study of the Constitution and the history and traditions of our republic, you could appeal to their wisdom and get them to intervene. Now what's happening is the whole thing has become so perverted that it's the out-of-control judges that are leading the charge into depravity. And, wow, I've done a lot of talking here. But this stuff just really gets my dander up. I just find this upsetting. Now, what do we do about it? Well, I had some solutions, but guess what? We're out of time. So we're going to have to continue into part 4.
Okay.
Next week.
Next time, yeah.
Yeah, the next time we're together, and we'll look at some possible solutions because I think there are. We look at some of these things and we feel helpless. But I believe even if you're living in the bluest of blue states, there's some practical things you can do related to curbing this trend. So what we've been looking at is the collision course, if you will, between manufacturing civil rights and the trashing of existing rights. And, we've kind of got onto this subject because of what's happened with Baronel Stutzman and other people. And we're just trying to bring this to people's attention, not to create a parade of horribles, not to be bearers of bad news, but reality is reality. This is the direction of our legal system and our political system, and it's gonna have to call for some kind of aggressive reaction by the Christian world, or we're going to find ourselves so confined by what we can say or not say, we really won't even have freedom anymore to preach the gospel. I asked people to, actually I never did ask them, did I, to post their questions and comments on Facebook, because we want to maybe spend some time reading some of those if we got any. But before we get to those, what is your reaction to all of this? Don't you love how I just put you on the spot there?
I do think that it's sobering, but I keep coming back to strengthen what remains. So we've got a lot of...
Now that comes out of the book Revelation, right?
It sure does.
Okay, that's Jesus. Yes. I think he's speaking to the church at Sardis, right?
Yeah, it might be. There. Yeah, My buddy Bob Dylan sang it too. So.
Oh, okay. So you're getting your theology from Bob Dylan.
Yeah. No. When he sang it, then I thought, that sounded familiar. So then I found it. Yes, it's in the Book of Revelation.
Yeah. Well, let's do like our Supreme Court in 1913
1913
did.
Before
let's actually pull out our Bibles
Wilson.
Here. I think it's in Revelation 3, around verse 3. It's to the church at Sardis, which is the church that's dead. So that would be analogous to America, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Because
America is dying to some extent.
Can we just give him like a high five? It's 3 verse 2.
3:2. Wake up. See, this fits perfectly. Wake up. Strengthen the things that remain, which are about to die. Wow, how relevant. For I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. Wow, that's prophetic. Because God still has a plan for America, I believe. I think the last election, if we were supposed to go over the cliff, I think we would have had Hillary as our president. So obviously God slowed things down a little bit. Maybe we're not going over the cliff at 85. Maybe we're just going over at 55. But he slowed things down a little bit, which gave me heart that maybe he's not done with us. And so I like what you say here, strengthen what remains. Okay.
Well, and then maybe we ought to take up Justice Kennedy on what he tells us. Maybe we ought to advocate.
And teach.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's my thought for the day.
Yeah, because he says teach and advocate, and you look at your typical pulpit today and it's silent. What are they talking about? 5 ways to improve your life or whatever, when maybe we ought to talk about the Christian heritage, that's been given to us. I mean, we complain about being confined to advocate and teach. Maybe a lot of us aren't even doing that at all.
Yeah.
So maybe part of the solution is to be a good steward of what little we have left, and then let God expand the boundaries. Anyway, you need to talk more because I need to read these questions. Here we go. Can the Supreme Court rulings be overturned? Obergefell v. Hodges. The great myth is once something becomes enshrined into a Supreme Court opinion, it can't be reversed. But the Supreme Court has reversed itself 120 times.
Yes.
So it can be reversed. And you know what Abraham Lincoln said when they passed down the Dred Scott decision, which basically indicated that slaves aren't persons? He said it's an unlawful ruling, and I will work my entire life to see it overturned. And he went forward with the Emancipation Proclamation, which went directly against the Dred Scott decision. So this idea that, the Supreme Court said it, therefore it's the law of the land, therefore it can't be overturned, that goes against what the Supreme Court itself has done. And it goes against what Abraham Lincoln did.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Dred Scott said if you belong to somebody, you belong to them anywhere in the world. And it took away escape, fleeing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why people just went, to say that someone could not escape slavery, mm-hmm. and would belong to their master or their owner anywhere and would have to be dragged back.
Mm-hmm. And Lincoln rejected that.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a famous decision in, I can't remember who said it, I quoted it a couple of weeks ago on this, but this particular man in the history of America said, well, Chief Justice John Marshall has issued his ruling, now let him enforce it.
That was President Jackson.
President Jackson, there we go. Thank you for jogging my memory. So this idea that and I hear this a lot. I've even heard Donald Trump say this relative to the Obergefell decision. Well, that's the ruling. I can't do anything about it. Nonsense.
And don't they say it's the law of the land? The Constitution.
Hello.
See, I was here for number 1.
Yep.
Yeah.
The Constitution is the law of the land.
Yeah.
That's our authority. And when we have unjust tyrannical rulings, we need to work within the legal system to change that. A lot of other wonderful comments. People are telling me where they're listening from. One person writes, tell me what you think about this. Go to local school board meetings and city town hall meetings. Don't sit this out. Do we bypass the local politics too much?
Well, one of the big issues right now in Texas has been these ordinances about the bathrooms. Mm-hmm. And now the president and the attorney general both said they're vacating that opinion or guidance statement mm-hmm. that was issued, I think it was by Loretta Lynch with DOJ. But they did that, and they threatened to withhold Title X funding mm-hmm. To the schools. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, let your school boards know where you stand on this, because see, they're facing that, and most of the time the argument they hear is, do whatever you have to do to keep the federal funds. So don't do things to lose federal funds. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the voice they're hearing rather than our voice, what are they going to do?
Yeah, and they oftentimes hear these well-organized left-wing voices, and they don't hear the silent majority. Another person writes in and says, I think God sped things up, but heard our cries in the USA and slowed down the wrath because our president blessed Israel. I would say amen to that. One person writes in and says, comparing America to Europe is like comparing heaven to hell. Thomas Jefferson, his wisdom in his statement certainly applies even more than before. But America must wake up and realize that much is at stake, and that a return to God's will and word and ways is essential. I think we would say amen to that. A lot of these are just encouraging notes. Thanks for keeping us up to speed. Good information. One person says, I see the courts trying to force pastors in the church to perform same-sex weddings in the future. That's true, and that's why we're going to talk about Texas pastoral protection legislation that has passed in the state of Texas that every state can imitate, and we'll talk about that next time. And so forth. Well, one more coming in. Okay. I think we'll postpone that because we're way over time. We're supposed to do an hour, and I think we've gone an hour and 10 minutes. So, just shows you the importance of the subject. It's hard to confine a big subject like this, to a certain time frame. But we hope that you will like us on Facebook. We hope that you will share this program with your friends and family. We hope that you'll join us again 2 to 3 Central Standard Time next Friday as we look at part 4 of our Tyrannical Judiciary and how to fix it. I want to thank Tomalea Bench for being back again and lending her expertise. Do you have any parting comments?
Well, can I clarify with you next
Please.
Friday or 2 weeks from now?
I think it's going to be next Friday.
Will you be here next Friday?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should be here next Friday.
All right.
So
I'll try to be here too.
Not planning on going anywhere. And so we'll have Tomalea back for part 4. And I guess that's it. So we love you, and we'll see y'all next time. God bless.
Okay.